Good morning. Good morning, everyone.
Well,
So good to see everyone here this morning. I will give it a few minutes to let everyone get into the meeting. So good to see everyone here this morning. I'm going to give it just a few more minutes to let everyone get logged in this morning. It's so good to see so many familiar faces.
Good morning.
Good morning, Mike. How are you doing this morning?
I am doing well, thank you. And you?
Doing well. Good to see you. Good to see you. We're just going to give it a few more seconds to let everyone get logged in this morning.
Okay.
So good to have everyone here this morning.
Julia and Barbara, yeah, and
Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'll go ahead and get started. My name is Egypt Lloyd, along with my father, Dennis Lloyd, and we founded the Slave Legacy History Coalition in 2020 to make it an easier access for the general public and to also to spread the history of slavery. We are excited today for our honored guest, Treyton Littlejohn, who I will be introducing in just a few moments. But before I get started, I would like to turn it over to our lead coordinator, Naomi Gordon, who will tell you our announcements for today. Naomi?
Hi, good morning, everyone. So as I go through announcements, I actually encourage folks to utilize the chat to introduce yourself and maybe say where you're calling from, especially if this is your first time joining us. I'll also drop a link into the chat to our newsletter. So as I'm speaking through announcements, if there's anything that piques your interest, you'll be able to scroll through and navigate for more information as well as links. So today we'll be talking about Black burial in Boston, but I do want to highlight a similar event at the end of this month on death and burial in colonial Cambridge. So this will be with Professors Jason and Aja Lands, who will discuss burial in the old Cambridge burying ground in Harvard Square, as well as their research methods to shed new light on slavery in New England and colonial burial practices. And then tomorrow evening, the Museum of African American History will be presenting their Stone Book Award. That'll be starting at 5:30, and there's still time to get your tickets. And then next Wednesday, the Elaine Locke Gallery at the Hutchins Center at Harvard University will be hosting their opening reception for their fall exhibition, Renaissance, Race, and Representation. That exhibition will be on view until December 6th. And then this upcoming Sunday, the 12th, will be a trolley tour of Cambridge on Darby Vassell, a lifelong community activist who endured slavery and seized freedom with his family in revolutionary Cambridge. And as some of you may know, Darby Vassell is also the ancestor of Dennis and Egypt Lloyd. And I'll invite them to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And then Saturday the 18th, the Tobin Montessori and Darby Vassell Upper Schools will be hosting an opening celebration. Just recently, the Cambridge community, students, parents, and teachers advocated to rename the school from Vassall Lane Upper School after the enslaver John Vassall to the Darby Vassall Upper School. So congratulations to the community and their advocacy. And then October 25th will be a hybrid conference by the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire. It'll be on the State of the Union, a critical perspective on Black America from 1776 to 2026. And then moving ahead into November, I'm proud to say that the coalition will be hosting their fourth community engagement circle at the historic Charles AME Church. Since last year, we've been hosting a series of um, community discussions on local legacies of slavery. So this will be our fourth in that series. And then finally, the weekend of November 8th, Christchurch, Cambridge will be hosting a Darby Vassal Legacies Weekend. I know that they have a lot of festivities planned, music, dedications. So very excited for that. And then I want to pass it back to Dennis in Egypt,
Okay.
if you wanted to add anything.
Yes. Good morning, everyone. Did we miss on Stealing America? What was the
Oh,
last?
yes. Last one, Stealing America. That is a upcoming book, not yet published. Stealing America, The Hidden History of Indigenous Slavery in U.S. History by Linford Fisher. It's available for pre-order. I believe it's set to be published in April of next year. But the link to pre-order is also in the newsletter.
Okay. Uh, Thank you very much, Naomi, and good morning to everyone. It's so great to see all of our friends, and it's amazing how many new friends over the last several years we have, met and made, and we're very appreciative of your, support and participation in our monthly forums. I just do have, I have a couple of announcements. I just want to reiterate some things that you did. Mentioned, Naomi, and that's on October 12th, a search for Darby Vassal trolley tour of Cambridge with Denise Washington. Now, Denise is a cousin and a relative and a descendant of Darby Vassal, and so she is part of the family. So this is just an extended participation by our family in terms of spreading and supporting the legacy and history of slavery on various platforms. Um, then on October 18th, at the Darby Vassal upper school will be dedicated in school celebration. And I want to thank all of the individuals who worked so hard to make this happen. Egypt will be, my daughter Egypt Lloyd will be speaking at that occasion. And so look forward to it. And I will hopefully we'll see a number of our members there. And that is October 18th at the Darby Vassal Upper School dedication. And then finally, the announcements as relates to Darby Vassal, and that's the Darby Vassal weekend at Christ Church in Cambridge. Christ Church, as you know, is the burial location of Darby Vassal, who was buried in the undercroft of Christ Church. And on November 8th and 9th, there will be a weekend celebrating his legacy, and which will include, in this case, also some music by, if you have not heard, Denise Washington, who was doing the tour as our cousin, perform. You have missed something, and has a very exciting spoken word and jazz ensemble that has been presented at a number of events. So she'll be performing, but the weekend itself, sponsored by, presented by Christ Church, where they will dedicate a plaque to the life and legacy of Darby Vassal. So that is November 8th and 9th. And we hope that if you're free, that you can make it. So thank you very much. Now, let me turn it back to Egypt, who will introduce our presenter of the day, and who's a very fine gentleman who has helped us on the international level, helping us to participate with the International Transatlantic Symposium on Slavery. And but anyway, let me turn it over to Egypt, and you can introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Dad. Thank you for that. I really do appreciate it. And again, if you are a first-time attendee at our coalition meeting, I do encourage you to put your name and your contact information so we can thank you for attending today. I also would like to say a special thank you for our international attendees today from Germany, London, and Italy. So now let me say a few words about our honored guest, Treyton Littlejohn. Treyton Littlejohn is an honors graduate of history from Boston University. His research is reconstruction the burial records of more than 4,000 Black Bostonians first brought into the collaboration with the coalition. Beyond Boston, he also serves as a board member and a development director for Sacred Hearts Charity, advising on fundraising community initiatives to addressing strategic inequality in the Philippines. And he is also, as my dad mentioned, our international representative for Europe, Africa, Caribbean, and North and South America. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker today, Treyton Littlejohn. Welcome, Treyton.
Thank you, Egypt. I'm gonna get my screen share up here. You guys can let me know if it's working. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, you're fine.
Yeah, okay. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. I want to, start by saying thank you to Dennis, Egypt, Naomi, and Joyce for offering this platform to speak and all of the work that you do to, promote the work that we're all trying to aim for. I also want to make a quick shout out to Emmanuel, who's in the call. For those of you who didn't see his message in the chat, he works for Le Coq Nomade Fraternité in France. They are the only Black-run organization dedicated to the history of enslaved people in France, and in the work that SLHC is trying to do to collaborate more broadly with the international community. Just want to shout him out, and if you want to drop a link in the chat, Emmanuel, to the website and whatnot. And with that, I guess we'll get going here. I want to start. One second, by asking you guys a couple questions. If we were all in person, I would just ask you to raise your hand or shout out, but because we're on Zoom, if you wouldn't mind just holding these responses in your head, and they'll hopefully play in later on in the presentation. I want to start by asking you to think about the associations, visuals, and maybe feelings that come up when I prompt you to think about cemeteries and burial grounds. For those of you that are in Boston and Cambridge, maybe more specifically, the burial sites of Boston. What do you think about? Okay. The next question is about Black burial in Boston. When we change that, what knowledges, visuals, or feelings come up for you when we talk specifically about non-white and Black burial in the city? Please make note of this. It'll be very special to me if you might be willing to share some of these responses after the talk. And part of this exercise is acknowledging that everyone in this call, I assume, is coming to this with a slightly more nuanced perspective than the standard in Boston. And part of why I'm asking you to think about this is because a lot of this research is concerned with what is the normative understanding of Black burial in Boston, and more broadly, Black history in Boston. What is the mainstream consensus? And when you probe on that question, we see a couple things. When you look up Boston cemeteries on Google, this is what you get. You get the mostly Puritan cemeteries that were started in the 1600s and conserved over the course of history. You get the slate gravestones and these even rows, oftentimes marking, quote unquote, the forefathers of our country. And this is very much our normative understanding of this specific history. I argue, and I will argue over the course of this presentation, that this understanding of the history of the burial site is intertwined directly with the history and the way we understand the history of Boston. I think you can frankly understand a lot by looking at the cemeteries. This could be an hour-long presentation. Hopefully it'll be shorter than that. It will be shorter than that, I promise. If we pulled in questions about what you think Boston history is, what visuals and ideas come up when I ask you that. But with this work, I'm really trying to look at the cemetery and the history and, come up with a more simplified way of understanding Black history by approximating those two together. Um, just to expand on this a little bit more, I'm really concerned with what our knowledge system sees. And when I say our, I don't mean mine and Naomi's or mine and Dennis's or anyone in this call, for instance. I mean the structures of knowledge that we live within. What does that see in this history? So when you put into Gemini or ChatGPT, for instance, I used Google Gemini, a prompt like generate an image of a Boston cemetery based on your best understanding, this is the image that you get. I tried this in different variations. It's always something similar to this, and it's very much what we just saw a couple slides ago. When you ask it a question like, where were the non-white or Black communities of Boston buried in the period of enslavement and after, you get a response like this. You get something about Copp's Hill, and you get this quote: a key site for Black Bostonians during this period was the Mount Auburn Cemetery. Crucially, it was inclusive from its inception and it did not segregate burials by race. As a result, many prominent Black abolitionists, etc., from the 19th century are buried throughout its grounds. While the second part of that sentence is somewhat true, there were between 20 and 30 Black Bostonians at this point that the Mount Auburn thinks are buried there, potentially more that they're hoping to identify. The first part is a complete fallacy. This institution was segregated through design. And over the course of the presentation, I hope to dive more deeply into unlearning this assumption we have about this history. Move on here. And so I'm really concerned with where this understanding comes from. What was the foundations by which we began to understand Bostonian history and by extension Bostonian cemeteries as this kind of ethno-homogenized normative standard? You can look at granaries in the top left at King's, which has been in the news in Boston recently for erecting a monument to the legacy of enslaved people and the church members' attachment to the trade of enslaved people. Look at Mount Auburn, developed in 1831, the kind of rural cemetery birth that started in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and then spread across the world. And we can see in the bottom left, there's granaries again. Important to know that in the early 19th and mid 19th century, there was a concerted effort to conserve the cemetery and the ones like it inside the city. So moving headstones if it needed to happen, laying out pathways and building monuments, building an Egyptian gate on the outside. These are all things that are constantly in flux. And I want to point that out because I will return to that in a little bit. I'm going to be very brief here. I know that many people here are going to be way more educated than I am on the history of enslavement and slavery economics in Boston. But for those who are kind of zooming in from somewhere else or maybe haven't been as familiar, I just wanted to provide some context for the discussion that we're having. In Boston, enslaved labor in the Caribbean produces sugar and molasses. That molasses is shipped to New England, distilled into rum in towns like Boston. Those profits go directly back into the slave trade. So funding shipbuilding, fisheries, and agriculture. And I say this to, at the very get-go, confront this idea. One of the main tenets of the Boston mythology, which is this very liberal, progressive, abolitionist city, which in many regards is true. But I think it's important to remember that oftentimes the people, the white individuals spearheading that, were directly intertwined with the slave trade. Unlike in the South or the Caribbean where slavery was visible, quote unquote, Boston's ties to slavery were commercial. This doesn't mean that there was not a connection. Where did this money end up? It ends up creating the Brahmin class. These people are incredibly wealthy. And in my perspective and in some of the people that I've read and read during my time at BU, there were two main prerogatives that this class had. One was to consolidate control over the new economy, and the second was to create a cultural identity. What did they do? They shifted from merchant trade into mass scale factory manufacturing. People like Francis Cabot Lowell, we all know the name of, going on kind of corporate espionage to the UK, seeing the tactics that they're using in their infrastructural systems, in the factories, brings that back to Boston. And with a pretty small group of wealthy merchants with capital derived directly from the slave trade, they set up the Waltham Mill and the mills north of Boston. And these factories begin to process cotton from the South. So obviously, this class of people is very wealthy, and they're seeing themselves increasingly as agents of change. There's a spirit of patronage. They imagine themselves as the leading cultural authority for the city. Uh, at this time, or around 1810, there's the War of 1812, there's fears of immigration. American exceptionalism as a concept is yet to take shape. There is an insecurity on behalf of this class and the American gentry more broadly that they don't have a strong enough claim to a cultural heritage, say, relative to the paternalistic countries in Europe. We have no landmarks at this time. There's no Washington Memorial, there's no Statue of Liberty. So this class feels very insecure in their cultural identity, and they want to align themselves with this broader heritage of the great civilizations of time. So they're asking themselves questions like, if civilization should fall, how would future generations remember Boston? And I think that's really critical to understand when we start to look at the cemeteries. Um, they begin to write this narrative. They turn to nature, to transcendentalism, to the writing of William Cullen Bryant and Thoreau, the paintings of Thomas Cole and Bierstadt, the idea of manifest destiny. You start to see sculptures and public monuments being built in Boston. And it is here that many of the conceptions of Boston history that we have are written. This money also is pouring into institutions. So they're building things, they're pouring money into universities. They have the State House in 1797, the Athenaeum and Mass General afterwards. Mount Auburn pops up in 1831. We have this conception of culture that it arrives with the time, but I am hoping to argue to you that this was a concerted process on behalf of the Brahmin class, concerned with the question of how this culture of morality and learnedness could be disseminated from the top down systematically. And there's a lot of racial implications there that I'll get into. And I now come to cemeteries because you have a confluence of factors here. You have the economic of the city and the Brahmin class. You have this cultural creation going on, and you have these rural romantic ideas of the time. Where do we see these things converge? We see them converge in the cemetery, in the places like the Mount Auburn. So I ask, why look at cemeteries? Because at the end of the day, they are institutions that represent the natural ideological and cultural ideas of the time being enshrined in stone. So to the question of why you're all, I assume, on this call and why you're listening to me speak, which I'm very grateful for, where is Black Boston found in the burial landscape of Boston? Where can we look? Where do we start to look? And this is a question that I started with in my junior year at BU under Deborah Kahn, taking a class on the architecture and development of cemeteries in Boston. Where can one find traces of quote unquote truth of the history of Black burial in Boston? The most obvious answer, and this is where by chance I ended up, was in the old burying ground in Cambridge. This is a space very specifically important to SLHC and to the Lloyd family. I'll get into that. Deborah Kahn, my supervisor, who I adore, who's not able to be on the call today, she asked our class to scatter through the graveyard, find something interesting to write a term paper about, in essence. So I go out, I'm walking through the yard, and by chance, I stumble upon Jane and Cicely. For those of you who don't know, these are two enslaved women to Andrew Boardman and Reverend William Brattle, two landed men at Harvard, aged 13 and 22 respectively. And these are their stones. You can still see them. If you go to this burial site today, you will find their stones. I had no idea about any of this history. I thought I was taking an architecture class. And at that moment, I realized there was a lot to learn here. When you leave the cemetery, you see this placard or this sign as well to Cato Stedman and Neptune Frost, who were two Black Continental Army veterans who were supposedly also buried in the burying ground. And I just want to point out the one-dimensionality of this perspective. I mean, we're getting a one-dimensional face of these women and these men. And for these women, half of that one dimension is their enslaver. So this really got my mind spinning, and I began to look at the other cemeteries. So going to granaries, seeing Frank, servant to John Hancock. You can see his grave stone in the middle there, and behind that larger tower, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, that's John Hancock's monument. And this again was something I completely stumbled upon by chance, by just looking at the inscriptions and trying to understand. This is the only individual that I found at granaries listed as a servant to someone. At this point, I'm really diving deep. I'm starting to read more secondary sources, like Tom and Brenda Malloy, who have done a lot of work on enslaved people's grave sites in Massachusetts more broadly. Scholars like Angelica Kruger-Kalula, who's writing about many similar ideas, or not ideas, but evidences of this history. Some work that had been going on in Dorchester North, I became aware of three gravestones. You can see in the bottom right there, archives point to a fourth child being a part of this grouping of individuals in Dorchester North. And yeah, back to the old burying ground, Aja Lons and Jason Orr, who Naomi mentioned earlier, they have a project called Mapping Postmortem Segregation, where they are geospatially mapping all the gravestones in the old burying ground in Cambridge. And you can see Jane and Cicely here in relation to the families that enslaved them. So the spatial relationship is very fascinating. And they're doing all sorts of fascinating work on using ground penetrating radar to look at this extreme of the graveyard and see potentially if there are more individuals without gravestones that are buried there. You also find things about Copp's Hill. I'm not going to go into a lot of depth because I know a lot of people know about Copp's Hill, but it's estimated that around 1,000 enslaved or formerly enslaved individuals are buried in Copp's Hill. And that's interesting. I want to stay there because oftentimes when you start the conversation about Black burial in Boston, it ends at Copp's Hill. So, oh, there's about 1,000 people there. It's an assumption that the majority of that community is buried there. But I just want to point out, like in the North End now, where the trace of Black community has basically been expunged from that neighborhood. People like Kelly Thomas, who have worked on this subject, say that either Black people couldn't afford grave markers, there was simply no one to maintain the graves after their descendants themselves were pushed out of the neighborhood. There's a reporter named Dart Adams who released an article 2 years ago. He only found 5 gravestones remaining in Copp's Hill for this supposedly vibrant and large, and at one time very strong Black community that inhabited the North End. Also, I think the statistic is in 1720, there was estimated around 2,000 African or Afro-descendant people living in Boston. So if you do the math on that, there's 2,000 people living there in 1 year in 1720. You have to start to ask, where are people being buried? I mean, this is a huge community of people over generations, and all we have to account for it is 1,000 people in Copp's Hill and this smattering of other graves that we now understand and have studied quite intensely. And this is really the reality of difference that the cemeteries point to in the history of Boston. You have this burgeoning Brahmin class memorializing themselves with a lot of intentionality in places like Mount Auburn, paying for the grave sites and granaries or at King's to be, reorganized to best suit their ideological positioning for the future generations. And you have that mirrored directly with this reality of absence, uh, spatial segregation, and a lack of conservation of Black burial sites, and a lack of knowledge within the community about where people are. And we'll return to that. I just want to give you a minute about why I myself am interested in this work. People ask me this oftentimes. I'm clearly not African descendant. I'm an Asian American from Los Angeles who ended up at school in Boston. And I think for me, at least, it's important to explain why I'm interested in the cemetery specifically. These are two images from LA, if you can't tell, specifically East LA, to a cemetery that was one of the sole spaces where both Black, Asian, and Jewish people could be buried. There was a wide segregation all the way through the 20th century in LA about where people could be buried. And this place is where the majority of my Japanese family, Japanese American family, are buried, including my recently late grandfather. We have a lot of jokes about, or maybe I feel like we have jokes about how brown and run down this place is. If you ask someone from East LA about Evergreen, they'll say something similar. Um, and that's the joke. It's called Evergreen, but it's always brown. Um, and in my very young age, probably between 5 and 7, and my mom explaining to me why our family was here and why other Asian American groupings of people were here. And you drive in, you can see the Japanese section and the Chinese section, and that continues. I began to understand cemeteries as contested terrain. Um, these are not places that all people get to go and rest forever equally. And with the own generational knowledge I had of the hardships that my family experienced in LA, so internment, dispossession, discrimination, and racism, I saw how this mapped on to the gravesite, right? It wasn't like after my ancestor died, all of that went away. I understood from a young age that these mapped onto each other specifically. And I think those childhood experiences of going to Evergreen shaped my curiosity when I turned to Boston. And try to be brief here. I realize I'm taking up quite a bit of time. Just to answer a couple more questions about why cemeteries. I get this question a lot, like why, what's so important about the cemetery? Um, the first part is that they are collective creations that we create as a culture, and they demonstrate the past-present relationship between space, people, time, and ideas. I think better than anywhere else. Um, a lot of people have formulated these ideas of memory being created in the world, not just in our individual minds. That memory has a sort of texture that's social and historical. Um, and I think if you're going to start to talk about the sociocultural experience of a group of people, you need to consider the cemeteries and the ways in which people are buried and remembered. Cemeteries explain an individual's last will, how people want to be remembered, how we remember them through time. There's a social fabric within the cemetery that I think is critical to this kind of work. Second, they are spatial representations of social structure. I think here about Frank, this paternalistic relationship being buried at the foot of the person who enslaved him in a small gravestone relative to this giant kind of phallic monument. There's a lot of research about the trend of formerly enslaved or enslaved people being buried at the foot of their enslaver family in Massachusetts. So that explains a lot potentially of the lived experience of that individual. You can think about spatial representation as the segregation and separation of people like Jane and Cicely from the families that enslaved them at Old Burying Ground. How about family structures? I mean, Darby Vassal, Dennis could talk to all of us about this for a while. What does his positioning in the bottom of Christchurch tell us about the relationships he had to family, to the people that enslaved him, and to his own lived experience? What can it tell us about community migration and displacement? You look at Copp's Hill, and then that history is cut off, and there's no more knowledge of people being buried in Copp's Hill. How does that explain? How can that help us understand the forced displacement of the Black community in the North End through time? Another huge part of spatial representation and spatial analysis is having two things in relation to each other. So, what about absence? How can cemeteries, when analyzed spatially tell us about absence? So, this is a drawing or a painting of the African burying ground in Manhattan, which I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with. How can we understand the absence of a people or a gravesite as a part of this spatial representation of social structure. So I know that's a lot. I apologize. And this is probably, for me, what is the most important slide in this section is cemeteries show us what a society and a culture value. They show us what a culture chooses to remember and how, and it also shows us what a culture chooses to forget. A lot of people like Elizabeth Otto Wright have talked about if you are critical and you're doing this kind of material text study, by reading the stones that are illegible, by looking at the boundaries, by looking at who is not there, we can understand the logics of a culture and how they valued people in life. So, just to sum up again, why cemeteries? They preserve the relationship between us, they demonstrate spatial relationships as social structure, and they tell us what a culture values, remembers, and forgets. And also, we're all ending up in one. This is a universal truth of human life and society, so we may as well consider it when we talk about these dynamics and relationships between groups of people. Okay, now that we're on the same page, we're all here together. We understand the socioeconomic landscape of Boston, the dependency on enslavement economics, the huge gap between white and Black burial. The critical question becomes how and where can we begin to look for Black history within Boston? And how and where can we look to find Black individuals in Boston cemeteries? This is the question that in my research, when I was writing my paper at BU, you end up at. You can talk about the motivations, you can talk about the cultural things at play that brought this situation to us where we don't have an answer to this question, but at some point you kind of have to start asking, where are people and why? So you can read all the secondary sources you want, you can go to the cemeteries all you want, but you're only going to find traces of communities and of individuals. And at this point is when I turn to the archives. So this is an image of a ledger from the 1700s, death records of the city of Boston, handwritten. I found these on a website called Family Search. They are stored in, I believe, an archive funded by the Mormon Church in Utah, which is fascinating and interesting. This is another ledger from the 1800s. So you're seeing, it's a lot to look at. And at some point, 2 a.m., trying to submit my honors thesis, my partner was asleep, and I was scrambling to try and answer this question of where are the Black communities of Boston? I'd done all this research on everything else I just explained, and I came across this specific archival volume. I remember opening it up digitally, scanning through it, and I noticed something. COL. It was like a light bulb moment. I remember doing some research. Okay, it's correct. COL designates colored. So I know that this woman is a Black individual. And here's what we have. December, question mark, 1821, Kezia Abbott, a colored individual, 30 years old, associated with the almshouse, died of a fever, buried at South BGD, which I later learned meant South End Burying Ground. The record was created on December 11th. Her undertaker was Zeal Skidmore. Okay, what do you do with that? Oh, oops. My idea, or to just kind of happen organically, was to put these entries into a database. So every time as I clicked through these records, hundreds of pages, you've found someone with COL and also at certain points red, which designated indigenous. You put them in this database and you keep that process going for hours and hours and hours. And at some point, I arrived at a database with about 800 individuals in it. And it looked at the time something like this. At this point, I'm discovering new records. So this is 1700 to 1800. It's also an index that someone typed up at some point in reference to the handwritten ones. There's new information to add to the data set here. At some point, I opened the volumes that were much larger at this point because the population had grown, looking at 1848 and beyond. So this is a record from 1856. At this point, we're getting way more information. I don't know I hope that image is showing on the screen. We're getting information on spouse, sex, marital status, place of birth, occupation, and the parents of an individual. You put all that together, and this is where we're at now. About a little less than 5,000 individuals are documented in this database. I've covered over 20 archival volumes. There's about 30 plus still to digitize. We're at a scope of about 165 years at this point, and roughly 8 new burial places are now understood as places of Black burial. And when I say as places of Black burial, I mean there's a frequency and a population worth considering. So, beyond 3, 4, or 5 individuals. This obviously can't be comprehensive. There's no way for me to say this is every Black person that was buried in Boston in this time period. We're relying on municipal records, but this is the information that we have. What do we gain from this work? What can we do with this work? The first thing we can do is statistical analysis. So when you have 5,000 people in a database like that, you can ask, okay, what percent of this population of people were buried in what cemetery? So the first thing that really kicked off, I think actually this presentation initially was going to be about the research on the South End Burying Ground, because that was the first finding, was that 65.5% of all, or not all, of this data set, individuals that are known as colored between 1801 and 1848 are ending up in the South End Burying Ground. The second most populated response is unknown, and the third is Copp's Hill. When you look at the entire set, you see 49.8% of Black individuals in this data capture are buried in the South End. So from 1700 to 1864, 65, it's the South End. I check this by obviously looking at people not listed as colored, and you see very different trends. You see places like Mount Auburn, the grave sites in the center of town. You don't see the high level of frequency at places like the South End Burying Ground or the South Boston Farm Cemetery or the South Boston Cemetery. You can continue this analysis. You can look at the cause of death of the Black community. So 25.7% of people of this community in this data set are dying of consumption or tuberculosis. You can compare that to the non-Black community. You can ask questions like, between 1700 and 1800, what percent of Black individuals were granted a last name within the archive? You see that 91.4% were not. They were listed as unknown or blank. You can identify burial locations. You can understand the leading causes of death by age or gender. You can look at the associations that people had with institutions. So the House of Industry, the House of Corrections, the almshouse. When you run these numbers, you find that 35.3% of all Black individuals in this data set are associated with an institution. You can look at the frequency of kinship networks. How many people have someone with a last name similar to them versus not? What is the number of deaths per year? What is the frequency of death by age? You can see huge spikes for infants that are larger within the Black community than within the white community. You can look at ties to enslavement. So 107 individuals in this data set are listed as servant to someone. 317 are listed as Negro of, 17 as Indian of, and 72 as Negro child of. You can do really complex things with this information. Like, you can do something like we did here, the distribution of tomb numbers by year for the South End Burying Ground specifically. So you look at only the people buried in the South End Burying Ground, and you look at the tomb numbers, and you say, by year, how is the spread occurring? And you can see here, the orange on the left is tomb 110, right? So you can see the frequency of all Black people buried in the South End that are ending up. You can see it shrinking as the years go on. As that's occurring, you can see the blue, the dark blue, tomb 112 increasing. When you look at that, you can say, okay, there was a trend of people being buried in one tomb, and as that tomb filled up, they were moved, or people that were added to the cemetery were put in a different tomb right next to it. What's interesting about that, my supervisor Kira pointed this out, is you see that tomb 110 reoccurs a few years later. You can see the orange again increases. You can see that 112, also the dark blue increases. Does this mean that within this cemetery in the South End, as groups of Black people were buried in these tombs, as they decomposed, were they then re-entombed with new people? Were new people being added to these tombs over time? All sorts of questions that you can begin to grasp with this database. And you can approximate this with some primary sources. So looking at the bills of mortality of the municipal record keepers, and you find that in this period of time, I'll simplify this, the rate of which what percentage of every 100 people within the white or Black community were dying year to year. And you can see an almost twofold difference between the Black and the white community over time. So you can begin to kind of approximate a conception of what death in Boston began to look like when you separate them out by race. What else can you do? You can identify kinship networks. So I pulled two examples here. You can see the Bell family on the left. I don't know if I can zoom in here. So I want to specifically point out Jonathan Bell, who's here, who died at the age of 38, and Isabella B. Bell. So you can see that her is Jonathan Bell. You can see that he dies November 12th, 1852. She dies at the age of 2, February 25th, 1853. So right after her father is dying, she is dying as well. She's dying of marasmus, and they're both ending up in East Boston Cemetery. Interesting. When you scroll down, you can get even more information. Okay, he died supposedly at 23 Southwark. She dies at 8 Southwark Street. So you can begin to see the connectivity across time of family units. Another example being the Bean family. So you see Matilda, who's 27 years old, dies April 26th, 1854. And 2 weeks later, on May 5th, 1854, Charles, who has Matilda listed as his family, dies at 14 days old of fever. She dies puerperal, which is a postpartum infection. And you can see they're both buried at Deer Island Cemetery by the same undertaker, and they're both dying at the Deer Island Hospital. So I hope it makes sense how this sort of research can begin to take shape. And you can begin to understand, yes, these are people in an index, in a database, in a ledger, but they're also humans that have connectivity to other people and stories attached to that. And for me, that's one of the most exciting things about this work. Another thing you can do is site specificity. So when you have tomb number information, you can look at someone's like Albert Ambush, who died at 2 years and 6 months in the South End Burying Ground in Tomb 103. When you have that information and you find a map like this that lists the tomb numbers on the side of the burying ground, you can now specifically locate Black individuals within the burial landscape of Boston. And this is work that, this is a lot to do, and this is something that I haven't even specifically been able to undertake myself. I realize we're going a little short on time. I don't high frequency burial site. It deserves a little bit of explanation. This site, when you go to it today, is closed off. There's a sign that says that 11,000 individuals are buried there, and it was a potter's field of kinds. There's no reference to the fact that around 65.5% of Black individuals in that time period when the burial site was most active are buried in the South End. Graves here were dug really shallow. This was on a marsh that constantly flooded. So the standard of giving a certain amount of feet to how deep someone had to be buried at the South End, it was only 3 feet. And you have stories in the newspapers of people talking about 3, 4, 5 people being stacked on top of each other inside the burial site. You have stories of a tomb of 500 children. This is not a pretty sight or a pretty place. You can see it pop up in the maps over time. So this is in 1834. You can see, I believe this is in the 1850s, and then in the 1870s, The city then begins to develop this property. So a man named George Davis begins purchasing tombs on the edge. He builds a piano factory. This piano factory burns. The walls fall onto some of the tombs. Therefore, he then buys more land from the city. And in the process of that construction, numerous coffins and tombs of individuals and their bones are unearthed. This is now in the 1900s. This land is sold to for the construction of a St. James Hotel. It's then owned by the New England Conservatory of Music. In 1882 to 1884, there is a large-scale removal of human remains from the burial site. Most people believe that they ended up on Deer Isle. There are some newspaper articles of people talking about a barge being sent down the river, or not down the river, across the harbor to Deer Isle with a mass of stinking people, quote unquote. And you can see in this image here, a quarter almost of that burial site has been carved out for the Conservatory of Music. In 1902, this becomes the Franklin Square House, which at the time became one of the largest hotels for young women and girls to come work in the city and became incredibly important within the suffragist movement. What I find fascinating about this photo taken in the left is the burial site. So where these women are sitting is directly on top of where the remains of individuals were, and predominantly in American individuals. And this is the building as we kind of know it today, the Franklin Square House. You can see the wall of the burial site there. This is what it looks like today. You can see the apartment building that now carves out that burial site. 2,145 people in this database are known to be buried in the South End Burying Ground. How many of those people were displaced over time is completely unknown to me. But again, this image to me really sums up all of this research. It's what do we do with the people that we bury? What are the politics of that? How are people treated in death? And is this trend seen across the city? When you look at the next most populated sites in the database, the obvious answer is yes. So after Southend, it's the old Sexton's Bills, which is church records, and then 404 unknown individuals of where they were buried. Then we have Copp's Hill, 267 individuals we know are buried there in the data set. The next is East Boston Cemetery or Bennington Street, 219. This has a fascinating history as well. South Boston Cemetery has 104 individuals, and it is now a school. They completely leveled the burial ground and put a school there. Interestingly, you can see St. Augustine's Church Cemetery there. It's a Catholic cemetery. We know that there's only one Black person in the data set that was buried there, and that cemetery is completely fine today. We then look at South Boston Farm Cemetery. So 101 individuals buried there. You can see, and this is something that Joe Bagley, the city archaeologist, and I have talked about, is identifying where people there were buried, where those tombs might be. This is where the Edison Power Station is. And there's all these plans to develop it into a kind of residential commercial district. I'm really concerned about, are there people buried there? Hundreds of people. Woodlawn has 94, all the way in Everett. St. Matthew's Church Cemetery has 81 individuals. It's now a residential block. You have Kearsarge and St. Joseph's in Roxbury, which I won't go into depth on, but they're now both parking lots. Deer Island Cemetery has 29 Black individuals. This was a concentration camp of indigenous peoples initially. They were basically between 500 and 1,000 indigenous people that were brought there and left to starve over the course of a winter. It then became a quarantine hospital. So there's a lot of Irish immigrants that were buried here. And consequently, this became a place to dump bodies that were undesirable. So we have people coming in from the South End. The Almshouse and the House of Industry relocate here in the 1850s. And I've located this spot as what I assume to be the location of the burial site based on national park records. There's also Rainsford Island, which has 15 individuals. Why is this important? Because when you look at the data set and you look at Central Burying Ground, Mount Auburn, Granary, Kings, the ones that we acknowledge to be the burial sites of Boston, we see 12, 19 Black individuals in this data set of roughly 5,000 are buried in these burial sites. 67% of the Black individuals in this data set are buried in a burial site today that has either been destroyed, redeveloped, or partially destroyed. This is the majority of the experience of Black individuals in Boston. They're in burial sites that no longer exist. So, what are the stakes of this? The first thing is confronting deliberate erasure. This erasure from the landscape was a deliberate process on behalf of the Bostonian culture and society. It was a structural denial of memory, dignity, and civic belonging. As I explained before, these cemeteries are clearly not neutral. And for me, the central question becomes who gets to be remembered? In 18th and 19th century Boston, it's very clear that how that question is answered is determined by race and power. These individuals were subject to memory and ontological exclusion that permeated generationally. It wasn't just whether or not someone had a headstone, it was, are you remembered in the city's official memory or not? So continuing on, like, kind of the stakes of this, for me, it confronts three things. It's Bostonian identity. This is something that Anne Moritz last month talked about, is confronting the conceived notion of what Bostonian history is. This research challenges the idea that Boston was this haven of liberal abolitionism. It proves that the logics of slavery economics, of segregation permeated into the 19th century. The wealth that was created off of the labor and lives of these people, of course, these people were not going to be remembered in the same way as everyone else. And I hope that this database might be able to prove some evidence of that. Kiera Singleton, my supervisor on this project, and has said something to me. People's bodies are evidence, and you can't deny the bodies. I mean, this is indisputable fact about the lived and death experiences of Black Bostonians. The second part is, I hope for descendant communities that this might be an additional tool in the forward progress towards reparative justice. I hope that even though this is a little part of it, that those 5,000 individuals and their descendants might feel a little bit more dignity, that there is an effort on behalf of the city and on the behalf of researchers to identify where they are, to map out their kinship networks, and to make this research accessible. Simply, for me, it's about validating the knowledge that communities have held for a long time. Carrie Greenidge, who I know has spoken at SLHC, said something to me very early on when I presented these initial findings to her. She said, "Oh my God, my grandfather used to talk about the South End Burying Ground. Like that's the place of Black souls in Boston." For me, the hugest part of this work is validating that experience. And the last part for me is thinking about the practice of history. What does it mean to make a methodological intervention into this history? And what does it mean to challenge the academic pessimism that says Black and poor people are absent from the archive? They are absent from the public square, and it's really hard to find them. For me, this is a form of racism. It is a problem of historians like myself not asking the right questions. It's a racist assumption to assume that the lived experiences of Black people has been so paved over that there's nothing to glean from these records and from the urban fabric of the city. So the motivation for me is to prove that you can find Black history. You have to challenge the conventions of the archive and ask new questions of it. Even these state archives, these municipal ledgers, when you pick through them at 2 in the morning and you pull out people in a specific way and you stitch these stories together, you can reveal a lot about Black life, Black death, and Black history. And for me, a huge part of this is Can we dig into probate records? Can we look at church records? Can we pull in birth and marriage records? Who can help do that work to further enrich the individualism and the family stories of the people in the data set? Um, this historical intervention, I hope, proves that there are other ways to see than just digging people out of the ground. And it makes me hopeful about where this work can lead and the amount of scholarship and community reparative justice can be derived from an approach such as this. Um, there's also a huge frustration, the lack thereof, the lack of knowledge and the lack of scholarship in this space. Um, you find a name and an address in a brittle register. There's this initial moment of discovery of making someone feel visible in the archive. And then you are confronted with, okay, if I go to the burial site, though, you're not actually going to see this person. They are invisible to the lived experiences of most people. Um, you'll find instead of Kezia Abbott, you'll see a parking lot or a building or a paved over field or a school. So this intellectual victory of sorts is immediately followed by this profound sense of loss and generational loss. Um, and for me, part of this is holding those two realities in tension with each other, that people can be dignified in the data set, and we can also pursue dignity for those individuals in the public square, in the spaces that we occupy and we continue to walk past. So just to close out, looking forward, I'm contributing to the Mayor of Boston's Task Force on Reparations. This research contributes a chapter to that project. That research is coming out hopefully within the next month or two, so stay tuned for that. I'm happy to report that the Royal House and Slave Quarters with Kara Singleton are going to help continue some of this research to digitize the records, to expand the database, to analyze them, and to write about this work. And for me, getting this information publicly accessible into the hands of the community is the critical next step. It's living in its state now on my computer, and for me, it's getting that information into the public square and doing it properly. This is, yeah, I don't want to sound like I'm a blue collar worker doing this work, but it is hard to go through line by line and carefully transcribe someone's records into a data set. I mean, this takes time, resources, and energy. So very grateful to Kira that she is committed to continuing this work. Some next steps that I have in mind: monumentation and acknowledgement of these sites, further studying the sites, doing continued genealogical research, and more archival work to triangulate information. So pulling in probate records, church records, property records, oral histories to make this data set a living, breathing thing. Ultimately, this is a first step. This is not a solution. This is not the end of the line. This is just a starting point. And I'll leave with just my final thoughts when I kind of think about this work is that the dead are not lost. They were buried, and now we have one new tool for finding them. A quote that has been really important for me in considering this work this whole time is by Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. I ask no monument, proud and high, to arrest the gaze of the passerby. All my yearning spirit craves is bury me not in a land of slaves. This is just the beginning. So thank you so much. I look forward to your questions.
Treyton, thank you. Thank you very much for this very, very compelling and comprehensive and certainly interesting. And thank you for the work that you have done on this. This is, quite wonderful. We have a number of questions that are in this chat here that we just like to ask. Naomi, did you look at any of them, or
Yeah,
how
so
do you?
we have a lot of great comments and questions in the chat. I do want to acknowledge we are at 11:34, so if people need to hop off, we won't take that personally. But a recording will be made available to our YouTube. Leslie Brunetta wanted to share that Charles Lennox, who's a rich Black man with two gravestones for his family in the Cambridge burial ground was totally written out of Cambridge history. And the placement of his plot suggests the ground was segregated. So Leslie has actually shared an article from Cambridge Day on that in the chat, if folks wanted to check that out.
Would it be okay if I just quickly said something?
Yeah, absolutely.
First of all, thank you so much for this work. It's fantastic and it's unbelievably valuable. So Charles Lennox's grave is actually illustrative of many of the points that you made. I discovered that he was buried there probably after you visited there, so it's not, I don't know if you know about him or not. His daughter's grave is very highly decorated. The reason he was a rich man, he made his fortune lending money to Harvard professors, students, and Cambridge and Harvard Square merchants, which is possibly one of the reasons he's been written out of Cambridge history. If you recognize his name, Charles Lennox, he's actually the uncle of Charles Lennox Remond. He owned a big house in Harvard Square. He's not mentioned in any of the standard Cambridge histories. And something that Dennis and Egypt may be interested in, one thing, you can read his story. He's buried there. The placement of his grave near the other two young women's graves definitely makes me think that there was a segregated section there. The Lewis family, who are married into the Vassal family, had a family tomb on their property. And I am really wondering whether they had that tomb because they did not want to be buried in the segregated space. I don't think we'll be able to prove that, but I think it's quite possible. But I want to thank you again for your work. It's amazing.
Yes,
Thanks.
Thank you for your comment.
Thank you, Leslie.
Naomi, yeah.
So I'm seeing a lot of questions about access to the database, plans on making it public, and whether people can add to it, and also how the public can support you in this work. So I'm wondering, Trayton, if you could speak a little more to that.
That is the question of the hour, and I appreciate people offering to help. I'm really excited with the developments with Kira because I am not going to offer this data set just as a Google link to you. It doesn't serve the integrity of the data set properly. So I'm at the moment trying to find the resources and the proper institution to host this in a proper way so that people can access it, can submit entries to it, and can continue that research. This will be publicly accessible. Kira and I are just trying to work out what are the best ways of doing that that are data safe, that are long term, and offer the most opportunities for people to use it. So please stay tuned. And if you want, I'm happy. I got an email yesterday from an individual asking about a family name. And I was able to look, I wasn't able to respond to the email. If anyone wants to reach out and just has a question about some individuals or wants to see a part of the database, please email me. You can reach me at treytonlittlejohn@gmail.com. I would be happy to get on a quick call or talk to anyone who's more interested in looking at the data set. But with that said, it's coming, it's happening. Just bear with me a little bit while we clean it up and make sure that it's good long term.
Thank you, Trayton. And then Joel Mackel had a couple of questions related to specific burial sites, and I believe he also had a question about your use in AI and scrubbing some of this data. So I'll start with the first two questions he has.
Yeah.
So first, and I'm happy to repeat any of these for you too.
Mhm.
So are any Africans documented or buried in Elliott in Roxbury, i.e. Paul Dudley's Guinea? And question two, David Walker is said to be buried in South Boston Burial Ground.
Okay. Happy to follow up with that in more depth. Like on about the specific individuals. Roxbury is a really interesting case because the records are actually separate. There was a different archival book about death records that transcribed in a very similar way to the records that I showed you on the presentation, specific to Roxbury. There are some people in the data set in Elliott that I don't sure how that crossover happened. If they were living in Boston, they technically died in Boston and were buried in Roxbury. But I pointed out their Kearsage and St. Joseph's in Roxbury. Other scholars have done research onto those sites that uncovered those mass burial sites underneath the school in the parking lot. Roxbury is a huge, like that's a next step, is looking at these other records. I'm sure that I don't know because I haven't looked too much at Cambridge, but I'm sure there's a record somewhere about that similarly approximates racial identity and a place of burial. So happy to keep talking about Roxbury. There's more work to do.
Yeah, well, that's good. Let me there are a number of questions here. I'm glad to hear you, Roxbury, my hometown. And but in the interest of time, there are some great questions here. And why don't we just a couple more minutes here, Naomi? We can.
Sure, maybe one more question.
Yeah.
Again, Trayton has dropped his email for those who'd like to continue the conversation. Elizabeth asks, at what point in the records do undertakers begin to be listed? Do we know their racial backgrounds?
That's a really good question. So, to my understanding, the Undertaker column exists all the way back into 1700. Sometimes they're not there, but of all the columns, it seems to me that the one that is most frequently populated is the Undertaker name. You may not have a name of an individual or a place that they're buried or their family relationship, but you often have an Undertaker. And I think that this question is particularly important because we have a lot of suspicions, and I have a lot of suspicions that Undertakers may have operated in a geographical space. So Zeal Skidmore, for instance, frequently was involved with people at the South End Burying Ground. Does that mean that he lived in a specific area? And does that mean that we can therefore locate or approximate people to where they were living because of where they died? And then by extension, what Undertaker dealt with their records? I don't know about the race of the Undertaker. I haven't found any that would be anything other than white. I've looked at some of the personal histories of Zeal Skidmore and a couple other people. But again, that is another research angle that I would invite anyone to take a look at because we have that information. So thank you for that question. I will say, I don't know how long the Zoom can go on, but if people have questions, I'm happy to stick around.
Yeah, right. Now, Treyton, thank you very, very much for this. Is a excellent presentation with well prepared and researched presentation. So we thank you very much. A number of good points that you made. I did like the commonality that we all share, that we're going to end up in a cemetery. So when we think about all that is going on in the world, we do have a commonality here. Thank you very much, Treyton. And as Naomi mentioned, Treyton's presentation is available. It will be available on YouTube, along with all of the past presenters who have been on the Slave Legacy History Coalition platform. So we encourage you, give us a day so to get the Treyton's presentation up, but it will be available on YouTube. I'd like to just remind you that our November speaker will be Miss Judy Granger from Maine, who will, and Judy's here, I see her. Hello, Judy, who will give us a presentation on slavery and enslavement and the history of that time period in Maine. And so we're looking forward to hearing from Judy. Also, I just like to mention that if your organization, we have a number of organizations, or your family records or something that you think would be of interest to us on the Slave Legacy History Coalition, please go to our website, www.slavelegacyhistorycoalition.org, and you could contact us because we would love to have you present your bit of information on the legacy and history of enslavement, wherever it may be. We have people here today from Los Angeles to Maine, so we're very appreciative of this. Treyton, thank you very much. We again remind you October 12th, Darby Vassal Cambridge Tours by Denise Washington, a cousin. October 18th, the dedication of the Darby Vassal School will take place. In Egypt, we'll be speaking there. And then on November 8th and 9th, the Darby Vassal Legacy Weekend at Christ Church, where Darby Vassal is buried in the undercraft. So we hope that we will see you. We appreciate all of your participation, and thank you for all of you who have supported us over these many years here. And we ask that you continue to support us and share this information as we move forward. Thank you very much. And unless someone else has uh, a comment, I'd just like to thank Trayton again for this very, very comprehensive presentation. Hello, Julia, Barbara, El, Cushion, everybody's, see a lot of the gang here. So it's so good. And I don't want to mention people's names because I always will miss somebody. So anyway, thank you very much. Please look forward to joining us again next month, where Judy Granger will be our speaker. And in the interim, visit us on our website at www.slave Legacy History Coalition. And if you feel compelled, you can make a donation to help us continue our work. So thank you very much. Thank you, Christian. And we look forward to seeing you next month. Take care.